at the very base of our site, we have what's called a root directory. And now I'm going to use the word directory and folder. They mean the same thing for our purposes anyway. So you'll hear me use these interchangeably. So the first thing we have is the root directory. It's indicated with a /. Now this is the absolute base of your website. So this would be where it can hold additional folders, additional subfolders, and files. There isn't any further level down that it can go. By adding these files and folders, particularly adding folders and subfolders, allows us to organize our site. And I want you to really understand there is a difference between a folder and a file, or a directory and a file. A folder or directory is something that contains files. Now, files are the things that contain the actual actionable information. So, for example, an HTML file, it tells the browser what to do. A CSS file will actually tell, the presentation part of how a web page should look. An image, it contains the actual image data, but the folder or directory contains those files. It's a really important differentiation. Files are just those individual little units. So they can be HTML, they could be CSS, they could be JavaScript, they could be a PDF, a GIF, a JPEG. I think you get the idea. Now that we understand this, we're going to go into something that's referred to as absolute path. And you will see this when you go out to browsers. It's going to start to change the way you look at websites. With the file system, the way it is set up, you can easily identify a particular page on your website and provide the URL for it. The absolute path is the entire address of a particular file. So for in this example, notice we are at isaacsondesign.net. We're in the hobbies folder, we're in the knitting folder, and we're on the index.html file. So it is telling us extremely specifically where we are. So when you make a request for a specific web page, you are making a request for a very specific file found in a very specific location. For example, if I were to go to the main page in the knitting folder, start by looking in the root, so that would be the isaacsondesign.net is our root, then it's in the hobbies folder and in the knitting folder. We are then looking specifically for the index.html. The only problem with these absolute paths, while they're great, they can tend to get a little long, especially if you have a larger site. Now that we understand the absolute path and how we get there, we also can shorten up that URL if we understand something called default files. To make this clear, the best way is to show you an example. So if we look at our page, we will see that there is an index.html in our root. We also have an index.html within hobbies. And finally, we also have an index.html within the knitting folder. Each of these things, the index.html is referred to as a default file, which means that it's a particular type of file name that web servers tend to look for if no file name is given. In this example, we have isaacsondesign.net /hobbies/knitting. But unlike the last example, which was the absolute path, we also had that followed by index.html. We don't actually need to do that if we're just looking for the main page. So what happens when we have what's called a default file is that the web server is going to automatically start looking for file names that match certain criteria. Index.html is the most commonly used name. And that is the one that GoDaddy recognizes, which is why we are going to be using that for our class. It's the one I really just want you to get used to using because it is the most common. Some others include that some other servers you might see if you get to working with websites is default.html or home.html. But we're going to stick with index. Take, for example, on the last screen where we went to isaacsondesign.net /hobbies/knitting /index.html. But instead, if I just type what you see on the screen right now without the index.html, we're going to actually end up at the same page. So what this does is it allows us to shorten these URLs slightly without having to give a specific file name. You understand a little bit about absolute paths and what a default file is. But we can also use when we're building websites and creating links, in particular, links to pages when we are linking in images, when we want to display an image or a file to be downloaded, or something of that sort. This happens when you're coding your website. You can use relative paths. And what that does, for example, is if we are working on, say we've got the main page in the hobbies folder, so we're in the index.html of the hobbies folder, and we want to make a link to the main knitting page. What we would need to type is the ... and / first. What that tells our web server, we're already in hobbies, so we need to go up a directory level, which is going to bring us to the root. And then it says, okay, now go back down to hobbies, go down to knitting, and because this is implying that there's a default file here, then it's going to go from knitting to index.html. So that's one way that this works for a relative path. Another example is if now we are working in the knitting folder, say we're working on index.html and we want to make a link to the sweaters page. In this particular case, we could actually just type in sweaters.html because it's contained in the same folder. This is how relative paths work. And I know this is actually probably one of the most confusing pieces of understanding how to create links and this relationship. And so this is one I highly recommend that you practice and that you figure out, even if it's just setting up some simple pages that you can move up and down. This is where our lab site on our web space, this is what we're doing here. We have, instead of hobbies, you have exercises. Instead of knitting, we have case studies. And so there's index files within each of these in addition to our homepage. So I hope this helps make a little more sense. So now I'm going to take this one step further. And in this case, we have, in addition to these directories or folders and files, we have a lot of folders that we tend to use on a regular basis that, again, help us organize our site. There are a number of other file types that can be used, and it's common for them to be stored together in their own directories. So that's what I've got showing up here on the screen. For example, we have the root, which is the normal, that's our base. We have files, that's our index.html. But then we might have more than one style sheet. We might have several style sheets for different pieces. So we actually can create a CSS folder that will contain all of our files that end in .css. Likewise, you don't want all of your images. Think of the hundreds of images that you might have floating around in this root directory if you did not have a folder. The images folder is generally the place where you're going to keep any .gif, .png, .jpeg files and keep them all together. And you can create even folders within that if you need to organize them a little bit further. Then we also have this JS file, which stands for JavaScript. Sometimes you'll see it just called script or scripts. This is where if you're adding some interactivity to your site and you are using JavaScript files or jQuery files, they can all be contained in this folder. And lastly, in this example, we have media. This might be if you have any sort of videos or audio. So here you typically are going to find files that end in .mp3, .mp4, .wav, some of those types of formats. This also tends to affect the different types. Remember, we talked about in an HTTP server that we have these other servers that it interacts with. So for example, we might also have a database server that it interacts with, but we also might have a script server. So remember this JS, we might also have other scripts out here using something, for example, like PHP, that it's going to need that script server to go out. This doesn't necessarily affect how you code things and the address that you have. It's just important to understand where it's getting this information. The same is true with the media server. It might be pulling that media from another source, such as YouTube, like this video, or Vimeo. And so what this is all happening is it's taking everything from, say, one web page that has, we'll just take our home page. And it's, of course, using a style sheet, maybe more than one. It has images on it. Maybe it has some interactivity. Maybe there's a small form or something, so we're using some JavaScript. And we have a video available on this page. What our HTTP server is going to do is pull all of that information and send it across over to the client, where our browser is actually going to parse that all together and do what's called rendering, and it's going to render it into what we view as a web page. And finally, we as developers need to understand the difference between our local web development area and our remote website. When we are creating a website, we generally speaking, and I can say the vast majority of the time, we are not going to be working on a live site. In fact, where we're going to be developing this is on our computer, which is considered our local device. So local it can refer to whether you're saving this on your desktop, somewhere else within your hard drive, or even on a flash drive. But basically it's someplace that only you can get to it and not where the rest of the world can see it. You will build a file system on your local device that is exactly the same as what you see on the remote server. You can see that by the depiction of the file structure I have on the left under the client and the file structure to the right, and I have the equal sign. And notice they are the same. So how you achieve this is you'll create a folder on your computer. You'll create, first of all, a folder that's going to contain your entire website. You can call this folder whatever you want. It's something that you need to know what it is, because it's going to serve as the root directory when you move it out to the web server. So then when you use FTP, you're actually not going to move that whole folder over to your web space. What you're going to do is take all of the contents, the files and folders that are in it, and move that over so that the root of your web space takes the place of that folder you created. This is really important. Any files that you are going to use or call up in your website, such as images, CSS, JavaScript, any of that, they must live within that root folder that you created. Yes, they can go into the images, but see, it's within the root. Media, it's within the root. This does not mean your full-fledged Photoshop files, your development files. This is talking about, say you're going to be using images, so it's .jpegs and .pngs. These need to exist within that folder, because if they don't, when you create a path on your HTML page, it's going to look for that file out on your computer someplace. That doesn't work when you load it up to the web. When you load it up to the web, it's going to be sending it off to like some C drive location or some other similar type of place, file slash something. It's not going to exist on that person's computer because you didn't provide it to an actual address within that root directory. Other people can't see it. That is why it is so important to keep everything organized and within that root file. Because other people can't see what files are on your computer. Well, except maybe the NSA, but that's a whole different story. So that is the basics of our file structure system and how we need to develop it and how it gets used. I hope you found this video helpful and that it helps you understand how we connect with our web server, that relationship of how it displays web pages, and the file structure organization that we use. Thank you.